Yeah, thank you so much, Matthew, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to everyone for coming this afternoon. We really appreciate not only the support that we have gotten with both exhibitions, but also just immensely honored to be in the same space as Harmony Hammond, whose work is just blowing my mind outside these doors. And of course, not only to be in conversation with Porfirio today. So like Matthew introduced, my name is Dakota Mace. I'm a Dene artist, originally from Albuquerque, New Mexico, but I currently reside in Madison, Wisconsin. And something that really inspired kind of this conversation that I wanted to have today is my deep interest in not only looking at the importance of textiles and especially indigenous textiles, but also kind of open up this dialogue about the importance of the materials that we use and of course the importance of color in our relationship to land and storytelling, which really for me became a huge inspiration doing my graduate studies research in Oaxaca, where I was fortunate to meet Porfirio almost 10 years ago now. 10 years ago. So it was actually his workshop that his family had given on cochineal that really inspired the exhibition that you see today. So Porfirio, thank you so much for being here, and I will let you introduce yourself.
Chandad, Channan, Kechinadinaro, Kechinadinabe, Rabe, Basonidius, Navalashte, Yubi. Reciban un cordial saludo de la Nación Zapoteca. Please receive greetings from the Zapotec Nation. Thank you for having me, and thank you for welcoming your land. It is quite an honor to spend some time with you, and of course to continue interacting in such a meaningful way in these kind of spaces. Having to be an indigenous artist myself as well, and see your work in these kind of spaces, it's really important for today's society to remember and remembrance. Right, and to also how indigenous artists are engaging in today's important subject matters, and so spaces like this, Brandy, thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
And I should probably say, because you're probably wondering, he speaks English. Why is that?
Yeah.
So I was born and raised in Oaxaca, Mexico. My first language is Zapotec, which is what you heard. And later on in life, I learned Spanish and migrated in Ventura, in California, where I continued to live for the last 28 years. That's why I could speak to you in English.
Yes. If we could have this all in Zapotec, I would really love that, but we'd be in awe. But I think something, like I said, this whole inspiration of this exhibition comes from this idea of not only materiality, but also this deeper relationship to land. And that's something that I think really inspired my work very early on, was looking at the way that Porfirio specifically looks at land and this idea of memory. And that was kind of a big part of both of our practices, is as indigenous people coming from these very unique communities, you know, there's always been kind of this conversation about the effects of colonization, not only on our community itself, but also how that really kind of shifted the aesthetic and material shift within that. And I think an example of that is looking at the influence of Dene textiles on Zapotec communities, especially in the 60s and the 70s, and how that adoption became part of the evolution and adaptation of the weaving designs in your community.
Yeah, I think those things obviously informs cultural, and it also informs how indigenous people of the America has been interacting for thousands of years, and of course, the effects of the border and the effects of colonization. But one of the things, and maybe instead of me answering your question, maybe I would like to just ask you these questions, because I've been thinking a lot about it as an indigenous woman. Having the opportunity to now assist or have a formal education, what is that? What is that being like to you, being an indigenous, but also having an opportunity to get a formal education in the arts? Has it been complicated and to come back to your own community, or how's that been enriching, or has been maybe harmed your ancestors or your practice?
No, I really appreciate that question. It's something that I really kind of had difficulty navigating very early on. So I did my undergrad at the Institute of American Indian Arts, where the Indigenous experience is very much centered in not only the pedagogy that is represented there, but also a lot of the educational models. So then when I went to graduate school in Wisconsin, it was very much a cultural shock to me, and something that I really kind of struggled with is this almost ignorant assumption about Indigenous people. And I think that's something that I really wanted my work to kind of be representational of, but also facilitate this conversation about there is no static representation of Indigenous people. There is this very much beautiful evolution and adaptation that happens within our environments. But also there is this struggle within our own communities in terms of navigating this idea of authenticity and tradition. And I think that really kind of is something that has happened in your community as well in terms of thinking about, what is authenticity? And especially when, we think of big topics such as like cultural appropriation and, this idea that, Oaxaca is being heavily affected by tourism today. And, I'd really love to hear, how that not only affected you, but also your family's traditions.
Yeah, that is such a big and important conversation. We could spend the whole day here just talking about it. But in my experience, because I come from a family of not having access to tourism market, for those of you, and I'm sure many of you that's been here has, or that are here today has been to Oaxaca before. Oaxaca, it's sort of these cultural center of what we know today as Mexico. And so everybody and their mother and their cousin wants to go to Oaxaca, right? So fully, there's so much rich arts and culture. I often tell people that, you go to Oaxaca, you lift a rock, 10 artists comes out. And so, and I like to start with that because there isn't a word for artist in our own native language. The closest to that is someone with wisdom and someone that holds responsibility to the own community. Historically, our community was weaving blankets for either everyday use and for ceremonies. And so by the time I was born and raised, that market was already shifted. This market started to shift mid-1800s, late 1800s, much more so. It's much more visible, this market. When I say this market, trading with neighboring communities and into a more global economy and tourism started to arrive, much more so heavily present in the early 1800s. And so by the time I came to the Loom, which I was 12 years old, the market was already controlled and monopolized by that sector of tourism. And so now you have a market that's dictating fast, cheap, repetitive, and therefore what is really tradition at that point. And so when I came to the Loom, I did not had a great experience in that process because I was conformed to work for these markets so we could feed our family, right? We were actually essentially, my family and I were essentially the labor of families who had access to market. And so when you go to Oaxaca, you see all this romanticized, it's just beautiful. You want to kiss all these people. There's so much harm being done. There's so much hurt. And I'm not here to speak for my community, but I could see that being a community member. And so that experience freezes creativity. And for me, it was not a fun thing because I was naturally really curious, always wanted to make and do things. And you could see it and this is throughout the Americas and beyond, the indigenous architecture, the arts, the creativity that's nestled within our community, you see it, you still see it today. And so when you not conform into freeze and pause that to survive, that's very harmful. And so those are some of the things I have dealt with. I could imagine those are some of the similar things that you've dealt with of what is like native art. It's expected. Maybe they're expecting for you to weave, you know, a traditional rug, and so makes you authentic and makes you indigenous. You know, for the Americas, it's highly collective. Whatever that may be, that also for me, and I don't know your experience, that disrupt the evolution, that disrupt the creativity, and that also boxes me into a Zapotec indigenous artist or weaver for that matter. And I'll finish with this. I've actually don't really consider myself a weaver. I have highly respect for weavers that when I watch them work and I go, those are great masters. I'm not a weaver. I'm disrupting those things. And so, yeah.
No, I'm glad you bring that up because I think that's something that we both consider ourselves with our practices is more so disruptors than anything. Because my work has always been either categorized in textiles or photography, and I really try to push for this adoption of interdisciplinary because the work is more than that. The work is more than just this Western categorization that is unfortunately due to the commodification of both of our communities, and something that really kind of is informed a lot of this practice for me in the way that I approach my work is by a young Dene scholar, Larissa Nez. She had written on her thesis about this kind of the history of the trading post and how it kind of created this almost influx in terms of the damage onto not only Dene communities but also Dene women. And I think that is really complicated because the first time I visited Oaxaca, it's primarily men that weave, and it's kind of an interesting thing to step into in terms of thinking about the comparison in terms of gender roles switching when it comes to this relationship with the material, but also kind of this difficulty of how so many of us get put into these unfortunate situations of is it art or is it craft? Which, is an open question to you, is kind of thinking about that, your own struggle as an artist as well. Because one of the biggest things that have always influenced me is something that my grandfather has always told me is that you don't create in excess. And we're not masters. Like the land, the materials teach us. And that's something that I also learned in Oaxaca that, especially the artists like Francisco Toledo, has always said, he's never seen himself as a maestro. And that's intentional because it's like he's always learning.
Yeah, I think that word maestro, or that word artist, when I migrated to Ventura and I resumed my art practice, and people say, you're an artist. Oh man, that's I dodge a little bit too. That's a big word in so many ways, but also maybe I think about it that way because in our community we're not called artists, and so. It's a completely way to understand what art is, and so but yes, it's definitely this difficulty to navigate in not only different spaces but also to be able to push boundaries to poke the systems that's already set in place. In my case, I've only my education level, my Western education level, it's only 6th grade, so you are talking to an ignorant right now, and so that it's not common to to even be call me as an artist because I don't have that education to what the Western society has put in place in order for you to be known as an artist, and so my education comes from the 10,000 years or 8,000 years of knowledge of my ancestors. And my parents don't speak Spanish at all. You probably remember my parents, and they're still alive now. And so, so much of the knowledge and the wisdom, it's driven through the language and it's nestled within the community. And my practice has gone back to that and bypasses what the neocolonization has imposed within my community, and tap on into that DNA information, and listen to the prayers, to the offerings that my ancestor has given throughout the pregnancy and through, of course, the birth of a child within the community. And so that's essentially what I'm doing. And I think parting from that place, communicating to not only the romanticized conversation that the tourists would like to hear from me, instead touch on conversation or subject that are important to today's society. And what are the struggles of the indigenous people today, in my part, because we stayed on the other side of the border, that makes me immigrant. And so especially today in our political issue, environment, it's a subject that's very close to me. And so I think by engaging those kind of conversation, by questioning too, this system that's set in place, does it make me, as you can see here in some of the images, I have been, in some of the works that I do, they're framed. And so I have been looking into the modernism. I have been questioning where their inspiration has come and where they have tapped on. And Joseph Alberts, Annie Alberts, has visited Oaxaca 14 times in such a short period of time. And there's even a quote from Joseph Alberts and say that Oaxaca or Mexico abstract has always existed there. But see, through the colonial period, the abstraction, we weren't categorized as contemporary abstractism or modernism artists, right? We became second class. And so those are some of the things that I could imagine, some of the, very similar experiences throughout your culture and your career as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I appreciate you bringing up this, really kind of interesting topic within our community is this idea of abstraction. Because I think the way that we both approach it, I don't think I would call it abstraction. I think it's more so the materials are kind of informing and allowing that relationship to happen. And I think there is this idea, again, back to these categorizations that we get placed into, that causes a lot of damage. And I think there is this acknowledgement of the collaboration with nature and the natural world, and kind of shifting that language and especially commodification of natural materiality, and kind of thinking about that deeper connection that we have to the processes that we use and the materials that we use. Because I think in the exhibition, I speak to that a little, is like this idea of shared knowledge, shared histories, and, borders are very recent. This is something that, I've shared not only with so many other Indigenous creators and artists, is that we have always we've exchanged knowledge, we've exchanged materials, and I wanted Cochineal to kind of be that introduction into seeing how this tiny bug informs so many of our stories and our practices, but also allows us to enter into understanding that the evolution of our practice is necessary. Like, we cannot stay in this very static representation of indigeneity, but we need to allow it to flourish in the same way that we allow the cochineal itself to be our teacher and to be our educator.
Amen to that. And I think, some of the things that I often think about it, I'm just a conduit, and just to sharing the beauty and the force and the healing of nature. And I see that so much of within your work, the movement and that the cochineal insect, especially, and the indigo that you've used within the work. I mean, that is just absolutely amazing. And as a practitioner, I could see also, your understanding of science, chemistry, your understanding how the material behaves, especially with cochineal insect. It's very sensitive to pH, and I could see your understanding, and that's where that's our literacy, right? That's where it comes from, and it's informed by nature. But one thing that I wanted to ask you, you did mention earlier about the trading posts, and I think of the trading posts so much like the tourism in Oaxaca. How was that damaged or informed, or has that, or maybe been a blessing for your community, or has that maybe affect negatively within your communities?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great question because it's, so much of what we understand about the trading post era, and that's something that still happens today, is that it was to support our families. And I think that's something that you recognize heavily is that, this was a source of income. But the reason why I reference Bosque Redondo as the starting point of Taho Diene is because that is where our reliance on the U.S. government started. And it was a forced reliance. It was something that was placed upon us. And I think that is where this idea of the commodification of not only our family's textiles, but also this idea of design. And even today, there are still these categories of Dene textiles that are specifically divided by region. And I think that's something that, we need to kind of reconsider, and something that I speak to in the Beshlakai and So series is this, again, this idea of evolution, of adaptation of these designs, being referencing our stories, and especially this connection to the stars, but it's all cyclical. And I think that's important. It's like everything comes and goes, and whether those stories disappear for a bit, they always come back. And I think that's kind of the biggest fear with, the tourism in Oaxaca, and of course the trading posts situation on Navajo Nation, is like there's this fear that our existence will disappear, and that's not it. We've always been here. We've always continued to collaborate, and I think that's something really important. With both of our practices, is this idea of collaboration that just naturally happens, whether that's with the natural world or with one another, which I think opens up to a big question that I think there's not a lot of scholarship on, is this idea of Indigenous color. Like, I think there's something really important, and I think your practice alone and your family's workshop really not only inspired this work, but also inspired the way that I understand color. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your approach to it in terms of your use in your work, or how it informs your practice in general.
Yeah, when I think about color, and especially today's society, we cannot think about by looking around us, because I think we have been just looking at a singular path, and it is really important to look around us, especially being in a country with such a highly diversity of people and humanity throughout the world. But that's really important to look around us, to think about color. What does that represent to us? How's that influences what we do? How's that make us feel? That's really important, especially now. And so when I think about materiality and how that informs color within my practice and thinking about nature, color, if you think about it as a artist material, color is just a consequence of. It's a consequence of the deep relationship and the sensibility that you would then develop with nature itself, the cycle of nature, the availability of material. The plants are actually infused, or they respond to the soil that they are grown. The pH of the soil is going to affect the outcome of the color. That's number one. Number two, the rain. What side of the mountain you're harvesting? Are you harvesting a side of the mountain that receives a lot of sunshine, or there's a lot of moist? Was there a drought for that season? Some of the plants would actually saturate the color when there's a dry season, and or you might not find any. And so therefore you have to go higher up in the mountains, and when you do that, then the color, it's also affected then, right? So I think that's my understanding first with about color. And understanding also the divineness and the force of nature itself, the healing. My mother's second generation of healer, so I've actually learned about plants as a medicine, not so much as color, because by the time I was born and raised, the natural dye tradition was already extinct. And so, and transforming nature into color, it's extremely complex. And I think once you successfully do that, then now you can start thinking about the aesthetic. When we think about, especially just reading a little bit about some of the codices and the translation, the information that's available now, the Aztecs were actually certain corners, like the sunset, the sunrise, and so on, each corner is referred by a particular color. And within my culture, cochineal insect especially was used, of course, in the arts, but also it was used a lot in different ceremonies and rituals, which was another element that's pigment. Matita, this is Spanish. Cinabrio, also it's color red, that where the bodies were actually covered in red. So a lot of the tombs that was dug up later on, and so I could see that the color was much more. It informed spiritual understanding, and not so much of like the aesthetic that we think about today. And maybe they weren't making decisions of, does yellow go great with blue? Maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe it's more informed by spiritual. And that's actually, I believe, why our society got to where it is now, to where that color, it's not informed by a spiritual or much more deeper decision other than, maybe a power.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something to kind of speak to that is like this, I wouldn't say fear, but like the lack or want to do natural dyes. Because I had this conversation with a dyer earlier in terms of like, why don't you use natural dyes? And he's like, because it fades in the sun. Like I don't want to work with something that will fade away. And I think that's where, for me, it becomes this open conversation about there is a need to understand nature in order to work with natural dyes. Like you said, there are plants that will saturate more water or they get more sunlight, and that really dictates the output of the color that they generate. It's the same that, thinking of the plants here in New Mexico, so many of the plants in the desert, many people don't often think about, actually create this really beautiful palette that represents our landscape. And this was a conversation that I had with Roland Ricketts, who's really well known for his indigo work. But he said he spent many years in Japan learning about just the idea of indigo dyeing, but also how photography is very much textile coded, in that this relationship in terms of understanding the chemistry, but also it's not as simple as saying, here's a recipe, these are the exact percentage of like dye material and mordants you would need.
And recreate it.
Exactly.
and I'll come back to like
Exactly. Which makes me wonder, if you've run into that issue as well of these conversations or this like immediacy that people want this knowledge of saying like, oh, I took this one workshop, now I understand this color, and now I want to recreate it in my work. And it's like, it takes years to do that. I mean, with cochineal alone, it's 4 years, and I still don't consider myself an expert on that dye alone.
I think so much of that has come to the spiritual within an individual. There's a lot of that plays a role. It's depending. It really depends in so many ways how you're feeling, you're harvesting, you're processing the materials, and you're creating color, and you make work out of it. Sometimes nature does not wants to allow that to happen. And so you could pull your hair off. You could just be just like, fuck, this thing is just, early in my career, because I was just trying to put food on the table, continue to. There was this designer in New York, and I wanted us to make a particular color, and it was just a nightmare. Immediately I found out, and I said, this is not the route that I need to go. I continue to save the sovereignty of my creativity. And so when you're forcing nature, and that's what we have been doing, like you're extracting, you're forcing nature, and you're exploiting nature, terrorizing nature, it's not going to work for you. Even though, like you say, you have recipe. And so I think in order for that, as I said earlier, it has to be very mindful about the material that you're working with in order for it to allow you, because again, right, as you said earlier, it is just it's a collaboration with nature, and it's just that respectful and friendship that you're developing with the material that you're working with.
Yeah.
But one thing that's been sitting in my head for a little while, Can you share a little bit about what is future for you as an indigenous person?
Yeah.
This notion of futurism, what does that look like to you? And climate.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that has not only informed this exhibition in terms of the certain pieces that were created within the last 4 years, but also this idea of futurism grounded in this adoption of technological advances. And I think that's something that I really have struggled with this term, is that it's not about this idea of shifting our perspective and our relationship to the environment so it fits more within the technology that is being introduced within our worlds. But I think it's like going back to this idea again of a word that I use often in this exhibition is atketa, which means the stacking, this layering of these movements, of these different stories that are all happening within one another. And then for me, that becomes kind of the pinpoint of there isn't this idea of futurism. It is the allowing all of these, the past, the present, and the future, to really kind of inform one another. And I think that goes back to this idea of the cyclical, this idea of like everything kind of circling back into, not only our stories, but also our relationship to this idea of memory, because, memory is a difficult thing to talk about. Like, I think, in Oaxaca, you spoke a little bit about the codices, and I think there's something important to this idea of like the visual knowledge that was provided in them, but also how we have to kind of consider how we've presented the Western language so heavily in understanding the codices. And I think that is a great example in terms of thinking about this idea of looking back to the past in order to understand the future. And it's like, no, it's all happening at the same time. I think we just need to acknowledge that.
Non-linear, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, those are some of the things that's been sitting in my head, and I've thought about it in so many ways. And one, because the material, where my material comes from, it immediately takes me to nature and self and Mother Nature. So I've been thinking a lot about Mother and my connection, my emotion connection with the female figure and the illnesses and so on. And that's why that question was there. But when I think about nature or the future, I was also thinking a lot about the fires in Southern California and the climate urgency. And remembering that my mother and my grandmother, when I was a child, I would hear them say that really hard times is ahead of us. And I feel like I'm living that hard time now. And so I don't know if we have too long. We could imagine a lot of things, and we could spend a lot of time and money into, trying to get to Mars or, things like that. But I don't think we have a lot of time. And my prayers is that that hopefully the original stewards of the land could come back to that and could have another opportunity to take back that stewardship and to be able to hopefully rejuvenate and take leadership into if there's such thing as future. I was talking to my 12-year son, and also he doesn't sleep too well, just like me. We're always thinking. And so I told him, the importance of the simplicity of things today, as AI and technology has taken into a tremendous force and energy in our world. I say, how about learn how to grow corn? How about learn how to take care of nature? How about, if there's a catastrophe that will happen today, what would you do? What would be the next thing that you would do? So that's kind of where my mind going into when it comes to future. Also, within the arts, within the making, I think, future, it hopefully it'll allow that where a lot of these things, and when I say these things like conceptual modernism, where a lot of this thing came from this land. And hopefully there will be an opportunity for that information and the people where it came from to be highlighted and to be acknowledged, right? And so yeah, that's where my head was going when climate and futurism.
Yeah, definitely, because I think something that we haven't really kind of touched on is this idea of our communities both having to adapt to the environments that we're in as a form of survival. And I think that's something that many communities now are kind of dealing with in terms of climate change, is thinking about, how do we survive this? How do we go past this? And I think, right, for many communities, it's actually looking at indigenous stories and our relationship to the land to understand, like, these individuals, these people, understood that relationship. And then we need to go back and really understand, why we do certain things, especially in California where there are controlled burns, in order to make sure those things don't happen at a larger scale. It makes you kind of think back to, again, our Western society being very patriarchal, where everything is passed down through the male. And I think something you shared last night that was really beautiful was this development of your new work at looking not only at our mothers and our grandmothers, but their hair. And I think there's something really special about that, kind of being a connection in terms of not only being representational of a lifeline, but it's also connecting us back to our belief systems of, the land is our mother. She gives, she takes away. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about this new work that you're developing on that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't send those images there.
Yeah.
I move fast, and I like to pay attention to that. At first, I say that's not a good thing. I say I think it's good because my mind's always thinking. It's always like imagining, and I just really try to listen to that energy of which body of work, which is taking which is taking energy and taking life. So early or late last year, I did a performance piece. The picture's not there, so don't look for it. A performance piece of actually, because through the colonial period, the Mexican and United States border was put in place. And so one thing that we're not understanding is that genetic information that's within the indigenous people of the Americas, the interaction with this land, right? It's not our choice. It's in our DNA information. And I could illustrate that through the monarch butterflies, where they have to migrate to save their species. And but how does the next 3 to 4 generation, which is how many generation takes, how do they know where home is? I think then if we can agree on that, then I could say that it's in our DNA. And so when I cross the border, you could call Trump right now, he'll probably pick me up. When I crossed the border, I started walking at 8 p.m. in Tijuana, Mexico, crossed the border, and I didn't get to a somewhat safe place till the next morning at 6 a.m. So I wove a piece at the same time out in the mountains. I took my loom and I wove it during those times. That piece was actually part of PST, and it was shown at UCLA. Anyway, I mentioned those things because then for the last 5 years or so, I've really trying to just to allow that freedom to take force, just to be able to share what's in here, right, and not so much of what's being imposed to me. And so I've also did one work that it's a cycle of life. This is such a traditional design that you see on the walls of Mitla. For those of you that has visited Oaxaca, it's an important archaeological site. And so you'll see it literally in every rug that's sold in Oaxaca that the tourists buy for next to nothing. And so I was thinking, what if I remove that symbol from a rug and I create a sculpture in center of a gallery? This is at the Contemporary Museum in Santa Barbara. Does it make me a contemporary artist? Does it make me a conceptual artist? But when I was just on the loom a few minutes ago. I was a Zapotec crafts person that was getting very little, appreciation. Mm-hmm. But now that I step aside from the loom, all of a sudden I'm more respected. All of a sudden I'm an artist. All of a sudden I'm a conceptual artist. So I was just amazed, and it just amazes me to think about how context and narrative shapes how we consume nature. And yes, so thinking about the braids and going back to the braids, yeah, those are some of the things. I have been thinking a lot about how can people interact with these elements, and not so much of just thinking of it as a rug or just something flat on the wall. What if it's a sculpture? What is a three-dimensional? And through the subject of female figure, because I do recognize my essence, or how do I say this, my emotions are deeply attached to a female figure. And I do have a hard time with the male figure. And so I'm really attached to my mother and to my sisters and now to my wife. And so I'm really attached there. And so I'm trying to create a conversation and honor that through the braids. So I think throughout the indigenous, the Americas, but especially in Oaxaca, my community, the braids itself is such a important aspect of the women everyday life. Is to do, first thing I would see my mother, I'll get up and I'll see her fixing her braids. At the end of the day, my sister and herself are, fixing their hair and making their braids. So that's something that has been in my mind for so long, that representation of the braids. And my mother will wear it a certain particular way in her head and so on. And so I have been working on that theme, and Mother Nature, a female figure to me, my mother, sisters, my wife, and also healing through, thinking about Mother Nature too.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think this kind of opens up a different dialogue in terms of, especially in relationship to Harmony's exhibition, is this idea of materiality and femininity, because I think that's something that unfortunately kind of dictates in the realm of indigenous art spaces, which I can't directly quote Guerrilla Girls, but I think they said something similar to, if a man did it, then it would end up in a museum or something, which makes you really kind of consider like this idea of our material practices that is so heavily connected to this idea of femininity and to our bodies and to our relationship to not this, to box in this idea of like motherhood, but this relationship that we build over time with the materials that we use. And for myself as an artist, using especially processes that would be considered work that would be usually have been done by women, it kind of opens up a different conversation in terms of thinking about why is this separation that's happening within our own community, in terms of, if I do beadwork or if I do hide work, I'm placed into this realm of craft, but yet whereas if a man would do a very similar thing, there's this kind of gender divide that's happening. And I think that's something that I really noticed in Oaxaca, which I think, again, your family really inspired me, because the women in your family were the ones that spoke to the process, that spoke to the history and tradition of, what you have continued to do. But it's very much the men that were always highlighted in Oaxaca.
When it comes to the arts, there's no gender for this creative spirit. That doesn't exist. And so I think we could part from there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, it's just like this idea of like the Western kind of practices dictating, what is, this, why gender any, medium or process. But I think there is something to really kind of continue thinking about, again, is this, again, the collaboration with nature, this idea of, colonization kind of affecting both of our communities, but also, something that I think for the both of us is kind of considering the next phase of our work. Because I don't want to say future, because there isn't, this idea of future, but it is like this next evolution in terms of what we're being inspired by. And I know that you were looking at, this idea of braids, but also for myself, I've gone back to this idea of like quilting, this idea of storytelling through the practice of merging stories as one. But it's, for me, it's this evolution and allowing that these stories of the women before me and the women that currently inspire my everyday practice is acknowledging that. And I think that's something really important that I think is happening with your work, is that acknowledgement of not only your mother and your grandmother, but this ability to be able to kind of open up these uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah, no, that has been such of an amazing and very difficult experience as well, to have difficult conversation. But I think that's the only way for me to heal, and by me creating these performance pieces, it was coming back to that space of trauma, looking for some heal and some settling. And but yeah, definitely I have been I've been very interested in performance, the power of performance itself. I've been very interested in, of course, continue looking into the migration subjects and move beyond the loom, and continue to make works that more sculpture and continue to communicate nature and tradition. Yeah, and continue to engage with relatives that was separated with the borders, and continue to obviously embrace everyone that has been supporting the work, my work for throughout my journey, and I think at the end of the day we're all in this, right? We continue to need these kind of spaces for healing. Institutional continue to play an important role for a place of healing, and so yes, that's kind of when I think about future and continue to hopefully see that richness of humanity to come into be able to tell their story in all the spaces.
Yeah, definitely, which I think is just a really wonderful way of kind of concluding our conversation, is like this idea of healing that we allow to happen for not only ourselves, but also for our communities. And that was something that really was important to this exhibition, with not only sharing with the team in terms of participating in the collaboration of the work that was being displayed, but also allowing them to be part of that story. So the large Taho Diena series, I invited the installation team to decide where those images, those photographs were being placed. And that's very intentional, because I wanted them to be part of that and to feel almost like they were looking at their own family albums or photographs, and getting to interact in a different way, because so much of that exhibition centers on red being medicine and red being my clan, but also just red is land, red is our memory.
Yeah, I love those images. I was just thinking about my grandparents, my parents, and like there's so much similarity there. But yeah, I don't know how we're doing with time. I don't know if we have some time to for some questions. I hope you're not falling asleep.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dakota. I'm full of gratitude for so many reasons, mainly for the work. I mean, it's an amazing exhibition. So thank you for your generosity in sharing that monumental work. I'm also very thankful for you introducing Porfirio to us. I've really appreciated your teachings here, because
thank you.
I was taking a lot of notes. Your analysis of the market dynamics and its detrimental effects on creativity within Native communities, very relevant to this site, very much part of what the dynamics are around the market here, the Indian market, but also all of the other gallery dynamics that happen here. Yeah, the trading post is still with us, right? My question has to do with pedagogy, right? And obviously, your role, Dakota, as one of our faculty members at the MFA program at IAIA. For those of you who are local and might have had a chance to look at the at the MFA thesis exhibition last spring, you would have seen a lot of the incredible influence that Dakota has had on our students, and that's clearly demonstrated by your collaboration with Kea Henry, who is one of our recent graduates. So yeah, I guess the introduction, the question is about teaching, for both of you. It's sort of like, to what extent does your practice, include, like, what role does pedagogy play within your art practice? Yeah, I guess that's it.
Porfirio? Oh, okay. Hey, Maria. Hint, hint. We should invite Porfirio to the program. Yes. He would be a great addition to our students and everything. But also, I think that is, such a relevant thing that we talked about at Venice, which was thinking about this idea of the theme of the Venice Biennale was foreigners everywhere. And you prompted many of us faculty as well as students and encouraged us to think of a word that represents our pedagogy. And I think this is where I talked very early on about the word athketa and this idea of time and layering and movement. And I think that's something for me that becomes important to my practice as not only an artist but an educator, is allowing the materials to educate and to learn from. And I think many of my previous grad students can speak to this, is, that's something that's really important, is building this relationship with the materials, but also how that is informing our relationship to this larger conversations of material culture, and especially kind of the analysis of objecthood. And how, it's very much dictated by this very, again, back to this idea of like Western collections and institutions. So I really encourage my students to kind of consider, what does the term object mean for them? What is something that is representational for themselves in terms of their identity, their community, but also how does material start to inform that relationship to this larger conversation of indigeneity?
What is pedagogy? I think so much of that, right? It's for me, when I think about these big words, I look at the ground where I'm stepping on, and I look at around us. That's where it is. And if I could bring my sensibility to a level down, then I'd be able to interact with those materials and do my best to. I don't consider myself as a teacher, nor I plan to be a teacher. Although I have had the opportunity to, I mainly in my few years back, I was doing quite a bit workshop, and the more how do I say, the formal place I've only taught was Harvard University, but other than that, it's. Other than that, it's just, I think, pedagogy is within our community, within the knowledge, within the land itself. If you could touch that, then pedagogy becomes tangible. Then it becomes real. Then it's not so conceptually put out there. And let's be honest, not a lot of our community members. I'll just speak for myself. Not a lot of our community members even know what that is. So it's a scary word in so many ways too. But yeah, that's kind of how I think when I give workshop or when I do a presentation and things like that. Yeah, thank you.
Can you see me?
Hey, Don.
Hi. So I just wanted to highlight something that you guys had mentioned, is this idea of education versus skill. So I think a lot of the knowledge has really been westernized, and that knowledge that our ancestors carry, our grandparents carry, is like at a PhD level versus what you get going to school, spending all of this money on, student loans and all of that you have coming out of that, versus the knowledge that you get from years and years of picking up. So I just wanted to highlight that, is that what you carry in your knowledge of these seeds and these plants, because this is something that we might have to go back to just considering, what's happening with the economy, is that this is knowledge that we might go to learn how to pick up again. So I just want to thank you for putting that out there. And I think that that needs to be highlighted so much more, is that what my tribal leaders, what my traditional people carry, there's no scale and there's no education out there that could level to the knowledge that I value so much. And I find now that I'm referring back to those teachings a lot more than what I learned in an academic setting. So thank you guys so much for this talk today. It was insightful and fruitful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you both so much, and beautiful, beautiful work. I need to spend a lot more time with it. The idea of placekeeping, placemaking. And Porfirio, thank you. Love out to our friends in Ventura. My heart was breaking as I was watching the fires. But my head's spinning just because of the richness and the depth of what you've both been sharing. And I was thinking back 30 years ago when I was working on the legal aspects of cultural appropriation. And one of my colleagues at the time, Jackson Rushing, wrote a book called Native American Art in the New York Avant-Garde. And at that time, when we were working in both policy and curatorial work, there was a sense that there was time to work through these questions in the right way and generationally. And so looking out at the horizon line now from what you've shared and what we all kind of are sitting with, can you speak more to the urgency, especially with these issues of what you've been talking about so much about extraction and appropriation, and a sense that there's not the time that we had when many of us began working on these issues decades ago?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and I think that kind of more jumps into my scholarship in cultural appropriation. So this is something that I have been working with a couple of institutions in terms of developing for the last 10 years, is how do you open up these conversations in terms of this idea of extraction and commodification of Indigenous communities. And something that I have been kind of heavily pushing toward is that we need to understand the ephemeral in order to understand the appropriation of this, not only designs, processes, even identities that are being kind of extracted and taken. And this is something that I really encourage, with the graduate students and students that I work with, is thinking about our relationship to understanding not only the Indigenous communities within where you reside, but also how that influence continues to kind of show presently in different ways, whether that is through the way we consume media, the way that we look at those types of different things, but also, a lot of our experience as Indigenous people is that we learn through the land, we learn through those stories, and that ephemeral experience becomes part of the evolution and the adaptation of our work and our relationship to those materials, which is not to say that you can really kind of define, what is appropriation, because it is a very difficult thing to kind of place into a situation, but it's also, this can be very open discussions that can happen for years, and we still don't know the true understanding of it. But I think I can't speak for Porfirio, but I think our communities are very much representational of that commodification that happened very early on, and how it continues to have these very damaging effects on not only the community itself, but also the artists that are becoming that next generation of having to navigate those kind of difficult roads.
Yeah, that's definitely a difficult subject, and it's really hard to deal with that. But I think about those kind of attitudes. It's also that's another form of racism, right? Because we feel the right just to take something away, and we don't recognize, or respect, right? And so I think thinking it truly what it is, we could hopefully get somewhere. And another thing that's very unconventional for me to think about this way, it's I just so love and I get touched by see relatives, natives, indigenous of the America to have a place of power. I know that's a very difficult word, right? But I think that's one of the ways you could deal with that, because unfortunately that's what it is, right? And so see so many artists that are doing just amazing work and are traveling the world and have a voice and that could talk about these subjects. We are, trying to, or how do I say this? When I see that, I also see things start to equal up a little bit, and that's where, unfortunately, that's where respect start to level up. And so that's another way, conventional way or unconventional way. And I don't want to think about power that way, but yeah, having indigenous relatives to place of power, decision makers, things like that. It's really important.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, which is supporting the agency of indigenous artists and communities to control their economic development. Because I think that is where we, kind of shift away from this darker history of, tourism and trading routes, is supporting these indigenous artists and communities to adapt and evolve. And to support themselves, because I think that is the hardest thing, is this unfortunate reliance on these outsiders who dictate in terms of the design, the color palette. This is something that you see heavily in Oaxaca, is these young designers that come into the pueblos and ask for a very specific color palette, and those get sold into cities like Chicago and New York. It really causes a lot of long-term effects within the community that they don't see presently, and it's something that we're still seeing even today with young scholars who are looking at these histories of a commodification and the appropriation of design itself.
And lastly, and I think we're probably done, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to put people to sleep, especially after lunch. So the only thing I could think about, and through my talks, I hopefully my presentation, it's not coming out, or I never want to put myself into, or our culture in a victim narrative. Instead, I hope we can all think of each other as we all part of the ecosystem, and I'm trying to take responsibility. And if we could think and walk away with what that means to you, I appreciate that. And so, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.